Hello and welcome back to Louis Bertou's Music Reviews. Today I'm going to be doing a different kind of video and actually not hone in on a specific album, but talk about my favourite albums from a specific genre. Now, genres of music can get very confusing. I know I've been confused by them in the past. Sort of a genre, there's not that many genres of music. There's only probably, I think, 15 or so, 10, 15 named genres of music. You can see what they are on a great site called Rate Your Music, which lists them all for you. However, when things start to get a bit more confusing when you expand the genres out and you see how many subgenres there are within each of the genres. So even though you can have maybe, let's say 13 genres, the amount of subgenres and subgenres of those that you have within those are just mind-bogglingly intense and just lots of them basically. And I would consider ambient music as being a subgenre of electronic music as a whole, probably, in an umbrella term. I know you could certainly consider music made on a solo instrument like the piano or the guitar to be ambient, even though it's not being electronically treated. But largely on the whole, ambient music, for me, is electronic music or acoustic music that's been treated electronically, whether it's effects like reverb and delay, or chop and changing, sort of sampling an acoustic instrument to make it into something new, turning it into a totally different way to experience music than it was intended. Another sort of facet of ambient music that I think is really important is the fact that there's not really that many beats going on. Drums, drum beats, that kind of stuff. I think when you start adding drum beats into ambient music, you get different genres like techno or IDM or that kind of thing, or even folktronica in the case of Fortet, whose music is largely ambient, but then there's this groove going along with it that kind of, I think, takes it out of the ambient sphere and puts it somewhere else. And I feel like ambient, if you search for it online, it seems to have its roots in classical music, namely one composer in particular, Erik Satie, who composed piano pieces that were deliberately boring and wallpaper-like for his, for fun, basically. There's one in particular called Vexations that you should definitely research into. Later on, with the experimental modern classical composers, there's certainly nods to an ambient sound in the works of Morton Feldman or Arvo Pärt. But things really start to become ambient when electronic sounds are experimented with by dudes like Pierre Henry, people who are really boundary pushing in the 50s and 60s. Pierre Henry, Pierre Schaeffer, especially Ilian Radig, a personal favourite of mine, Lamonte Young, these kind of people. Stockhausen. How do you say that? Someone tell me. Anyway, I'm trying to build up a picture of ambient music here. It's got its roots in electronic classical music. But it doesn't have a name yet. Nothing is ambient music, nothing called ambient music. It doesn't have an aesthetic. It's just sort of kind of music that doesn't really go anywhere, but also it does. Music that has no beats, music that doesn't really have any sort of known structure, like it's not going A, B, A, B, A, B, it's just sort of here. It's like a still life that you look at, or a very, very slow journey into outer space. The first man to pen this genre was Brian Eno in the mid-70s. And it's quite a funny story actually as to how maybe not funny for him at the time, but a funny story as to how this ambient music really was conceived. And as far as my knowledge, Brian Eno unfortunately suffered an accident in the mid-70s, 75 I think, and ended up sort of being in his bed for a long period of time. And now a friend of his came to visit and gave him a record, which was nice, because obviously Brian Eno, by this point, is a very prolific artist, massive music fan. His friend comes round and delivers a record of, I think it's medieval harp music, which Brian Eno ends up putting on the deck. He sort of struggles out of bed, puts the vinyl on the deck, presses play, slumps back into bed, and doesn't want to get up again. But what he realises is that the sound is far too low on the record player. Also, one of the channels of the speakers has blown, so it's only coming out of one of the channels, and it's very, very quiet, basically. So he ends up lying back, listening to this music, and just being struck by how, because it's so quiet, this harp music is blending in and even getting overshadowed by the background noise coming through the window, or the sound of the fridge, or people talking in the next room. And this was a big kind of artistic moment for Brian Eno, because he realised that music could be background music in this way, and that the mingling of background noise with the music was actually something to be embraced rather than avoided. Now, obviously, this theory is mainly sort of accredited to John Cage, whose famous 4 minutes 33 piece is essentially 4 minutes 33 of silence, written in score form for any player at any time. John Cage was aware of this sort of seductive pull of not having music in the foreground and having it in the background, to the point where the background noises that you could hear alongside the music actually became part of the composition itself. And I think that must have very much influenced Brian Eno when he was listening to this harp music, kind of dazed, probably on some kind of medication as well, maybe recreational drugs, who knows, kind of thinking, oh man, this is what music should be, this is what my music should be. And lo and behold, the next song he records is discrete music, of all pieces. And there you can really hear how the influence of that one little harp record had on his style of music making. It's amazing. Discrete music is really a pillar of ambient music in and of itself as a song. But in terms of an album that really personified that shift to ambient music, I would go for Brian Eno's 1975 record Another Green World, which was recorded straight after Discrete Music, the song, but released before it. So the first sort of released ambient album, I would argue, is Another Green World by Eno. And ambient in the sense that it was called ambient music by the critics. Eno himself would label it ambient. The cover, the kind of aesthetic of it, definitely leans into what we consider ambient today. And yeah, what better way to kick off this list than with a true piece of history, Brian Eno's Another Green World. This album definitely follows on from Brian Eno's previous couple of records, with the off-kilter approach to songwriting. However, I think that that approach is now made better by this newly hatching idea of ambient music going on inside the head of the composer. And in amongst these sort of more conventional songs, or conventional Brian Eno songs, they're not conventional by any sort of song standard so far, there are these little sonic vignettes which just make the album flow so much more interesting, I think. But that's not to say that the songs themselves aren't great as well. I just absolutely love the quirky but also unbelievably warm sounding track St. Elmo's Fire, and then also the second to last track, Everything Merges with the Night, somehow manages to sound like the end of a program, the end of a show where everyone's starting to pack up and leave. And this is kind of the music that plays, those first few piano chords there, when there's only a few scattered people still remaining. And then that's not to speak of the album's closing track, where suddenly we're transcended from the program, and now everything's kind of floating in the ether, and we weren't even sure if the program really happened or whether this was all just a dream. That's Spirits Drifting, by the way. Definite highlight from the album. So definitely check this album out as a historical ambient album. It's not really ambient by today's music standards, but it certainly was at the time, I'm sure. It's one of those few records as well where the best material is saved till last. and actually my favourite songs are the last 3 or 4 perhaps. Moving on to ambient record number 2 that I'm going to talk about, my second favourite. They're not in any order, by the way, these albums. Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Now this one's definitely ambient because it says so in the title. And actually, Aphex Twin's first album also could have qualified for this list. Though it is a little bit more beatful. There are more drum beats going on in the first Ambient Works album than there are in the second. And I've always preferred the second one. I always favoured the sort of alien soundscapes of that second one versus the more techno-inspired nature of the first. But yeah, this album, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, is massive. It's a double album, 2 CDs worth of material. It's vast, but it's also addictive. You'll find yourself coming back to it again and again, or at least I did, until you know each and every one of the tracks. Even though they are not named. They're just labelled track 1, track 2 through 24. If you want more thoughts on this massive ambient album, then check out my full review of it on my channel. For now, I'll just leave you with a quote from limedibagels off Rate Your Music, who says, "Is this the best double album of the CD era?" Moving swiftly on, Jon Hassell, Dream Theory in Malaya. I've not really said that out loud very much, so a bit of a mouthful, but fantastic album overall. This is one of my go-to ambient artists, Jon Hassell is. He's fantastic, creative, visionary. He didn't even stop after his first few great albums. He kept making them. So he's been prolific from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s. Bloody hell, he made records last year and the year before that I thought were fantastic. 2021, 2020. The Listening to Pictures and Seeing Through Sound albums are great. So wow, this is a guy who's been producing music his whole life. You can just tell that it's a labour of love. And I really love each of Jon Hassell's big 3 albums. But in the end, I went with the underdog, I think, Dream Theory. One that gets talked about, I think, less overall. And on first listen, it sort of felt like there wasn't a great deal going on. Well, it's ambient in it. But then, sort of on repeated listens, I kind of realised that there was more to chew on than I had perhaps first thought. And I actually currently find this probably the most addictive Jon Hassell album, even if the other 2, Fourth World Volume 1 and Aka Darberi Java, are more consistent overall. This one is relaxing. It's so relaxing, yet it's also so sonically sort of exciting. Take the trumpet riff on track 2, for instance, that then kind of also comes into track 3, but it's almost like the riff, you've been looking at this riff under a microscope and then you suddenly switched lens as the track goes from track 2 to track 3 and you're offered a different view on it. It's a great moment. You have to listen to it to kind of work out what I mean there because I don't even know what I mean really, to be fair. But anyway, another highlight track from this album would be the closing track, Gift of Fire, which is just this brain massaging combination of trumpets, drums, water gongs. It's just beautiful. It really takes me somewhere, that track. So yeah, great record. Obviously the other 2 Jon Hassell ones, check those out as well, that I mentioned. Just don't get put off on this one by the annoying opening track. It's only 2 minutes, you can skip it if you like. Get on to track 2, 3, closing track, Malay. These are all wonderful ambient pieces. Moving on, I'm going to copy Deep Cuts here and name my next one of my favourite ambient albums as Fennesz by Fennesz. Can be quite easy to actually get those 2 words mixed up a little bit. Fennesz. See, I'm doing it right now. It's very easy for me to pick the song Chateau Rouge from this album as the best Fennesz song, period. I just can't escape how lovely it is. Adore that chord sequence, and I especially love when the chord sequence from the start comes back in around 3 minutes 27. And then there's this little buzzing sound that's incorporated into the mix, which it just bear with me, sounds a little bit like insects. And I don't know, it just gives the sound around that 3-minute 30 mark, it gives that sound a little bit of a rural feeling almost, even though it's kind of comprised of mainly synthetic instruments. It's just amazing. It always stops me still, that song. It's beautiful. Chateau Rouge. But then obviously, so I feel like that's worth the price of admission alone. But there is also other great pieces on this album. I would say that side A is a little bit stronger than side B. But we do on side B get the voice of David Sylvian on one track, which is a bonus, and one more heavyweight Fennesz composition, Stone of Impermanence, as well, which is a great one to chew on. But yeah, overall, I actually find myself coming back to Venice more than Endless Summer, the previous record that Fennesz made. And both would qualify for this list, but I'm trying to keep it to one per artist here, as you can probably tell. Side note, just for fun, because Brian Eno is such a prolific artist, what I did is I also made a top 10 favourite ambient albums by Brian Eno. So that you can find that in the comments below, because obviously, I could fill a whole list with his music, and that's exactly what I did. For now, we're going to get back onto the list, and I'm going to move on to one of the titans of modern ambient music, Tim Hecker, with his album Haunt Me. This is my favourite Tim so far, definitely favourite Tim. Although you can't really go wrong in his discography, I don't think. And this album, Haunt Me, is definitely ambient because it sounds so beautiful, but then when you try and actually pay attention to it, you just can't. It's just impossible to pay attention to this album because it's so low-key the whole time. But that lends it perfectly to the ambient genre, and I find myself sort of chucking this one on a lot if I just want to read, but I don't want to get distracted. Some more points to make about Haunt Me. There's just beautiful chords, really detailed mix as well, so it's good for headphone listening. It's a wistful, nostalgic feeling throughout it. And yeah, I rarely find the music distracting, although there is one particular moment on the album that I always sort of sit up and take notice to. And that is the start of the song Ghostwriting. Absolute highlight for sure. It's that spoken word sample for the first time on the album, kind of grabs the attention a little bit, and then you're perfectly ready to take in those really, truly ghostly chords that come in. And it just allows for the emotional impact of those chords to be maximised, I think. It's just a fantastic moment. I feel like you can't really listen to Ghostwriting on its own, you have to listen to the whole album, and then that track will be maximised in terms of its, like I say, emotional capacity. Great song, great album. Let's move on to a record, a bit of an underrated one, I think, by Labradford, Precision LP. Absolutely love the cover on this one. I've always found it very mysterious, and I can't get by with the reissue cover. I think that looks terrible, but the original for me is perfectly sums up the music. I think it's just sort of, it's stark, it's mysterious, it's strange, it's very American as well. That's something to add in there. Anyway, moving on to the actual music of the album. There are sort of two types of song, I think, on this record. You have the lengthy ambient pieces, and then there's these shorter songs, sort of more post-rock influenced songs. I'd say definitely this album is a post-rock album, even though it is heavily ambient as well. And the songs themselves are hardly songs in the traditional sense. Like there's no real beat or rhythm. There's no drums here. It's ethereal, and it's about as stark and desolate as post-rock music can get. I'm talking songs like Accelerating on a Smoother Road or New Listening. And they're great. However, my favourites are the aforementioned lengthy ambient pieces. So I'm thinking tracks like Listening in Depth, Experience the Gated Oscillator, and Skyward with Motion especially. Something about Mark Nelson's guitar tones on this album that really get me. Just they seem to evoke this feeling of cold and wind. I don't know, weather, especially cold. Just sort of take that closing track, Skyward with Motion, take the first few moments of it, play it, and just feel the temperature of your room drop a few degrees. I just love music that does that, that kind of makes you feel something, even if it is cold. This record, it may not be perfect. I think some of the songs are pretty inconsequential, or just sort of wander a little bit, or even too overly kind of sentimental, like the track Everlast. However, this is far and away my favourite Labradford album, even if the later works seem to garner more critical reception, more positive feedback from fans and critics alike. I should add, this is their first album. And yeah, like I say, it's not perfect, but what it does well, it absolutely smashes out of the park. So definitely check this one out, especially the tracks I mentioned, the lengthy ambient pieces. Okay, next up we've got Emeralds. Does It Look Like I'm Here? Well, does it? Okay, so this is definitely an ambient album, although its ties, I think its influences come from German progressive electronic artists like Klaus Schulz, Tangerine Dream, and others of course, but filtered through the lens of the current music scene in 2010. So the synth sounds on this album are more attention-grabbing than, say, an album like Haunt Me, and I feel like the compositions in general demand more focus. So this is an ambient album, but I think it is rewarded more by actually sitting down and listening to it than, say, having it on in the background, should we say. The record boasts a lot of big, bold chord sequences mixed with kind of these little bubbly synth tones, which really go to make a captivating listen overall. It's a very classy album, and one where a lot of real care has been put into how the album flows, sort of the ups and downs of it, as well as the maximisation of moments as well, sonic moments. It's a great cover as well. I really enjoy the cover of this album. It doesn't look like much from afar, but if you look closer, it's just got this mystery attached to it. Similar kind of mystery that the album cover to The Units, Ready for the House, has. I don't know, it's just creepy, but you can't really put your finger on why. Next up, we've got Grouper with Dragging a Dead Deer Up a Hill. It's one of my personal favourites from the list. I listen to this often. And we may have spoken before about how ambient music can have different genres attached to it. We've had post-rock a little bit, we've had maybe even a bit of krautrock, but with this one we've definitely got sort of folky singer-songwriter kind of vibes going on here. All of the songs seem to be voice plus acoustic guitar, but in the treating of that acoustic guitar and that voice and the layering of voices, we get something that is far greater than the sum of its parts. Sort of a bit shoegazy in that regard, like a band like My Bloody Valentine have great songs, but then the noise that they put on those songs wraps everything up in this amazing cloud of noise. I'm repeating myself here, but you get the idea. That kind of sound is also prevalent on Grouper's records, I think. The idea of having more of an emphasis on immersion rather than individual songs. But yeah, I just love how this album sounds. I love how it makes me feel as well. It's a real melancholic record. You know, if the sky is just grey enough, and if I'm in a bit of a more introspective mood, this album can just be absolute bliss to listen to. Especially songs like Fishing Bird, I'd Rather Be Sleeping, Invisible, We've All Gone to Sleep is another good one. There's plenty more, but I can't really think off the top of my head. It's just a fantastic, ethereal, folky record, and I'd highly recommend it. Next up, we have Flying Saucer Attack with In Search of Spaces. Not to be confused with the Hawkwind record In Search of Space. While Hawkwind were sort of concerned with rocketing themselves as far away from the Earth as possible, Flying Saucer Attack instead are finding spaces they can exist in and just be and think and really gain perspective. This is the band's live album, and it's an absolute corker. It's up there with, I think, the band's studio work, for sure, some of the best of the studio work. And if you like your drones desolate, like I do, then you will definitely like this album. Interestingly enough, the band, I think, are very influenced by the sea They take a lot of sort of influence and inspiration from the sea in the music, and I can really hear that, especially on this live album. Kind of sounds like you're stranded on a windswept beach somewhere on the UK coast, with rain, like horizontal rain, lashing at you from actually both sides. So there's left and right horizontal rain somehow coming at you. And that's where this album puts me when I listen to it. Now, a little note about In Search of Spaces. Definitely check out the reissue, because that has more material than the original. I would say the reissue is a more exhaustive listen, and that's sort of what you want when you're after a good drony ambient album. But I will also add, if you want a friendlier start to the band, let's say you haven't listened to this band before, you probably don't want an hour and a half long album of 4 unnamed songs, which is exactly what this record is. So I'd say maybe go back to the compilations Chorus and... what's the other one called? Distance and Chorus, especially the songs Beach Red Lullaby and Crystal Shade from those records. Those 2 songs, Crystal Shade, Beach Red Lullaby, are just 2 like perfect sonic sculptures for the ages. I just absolutely adore those songs. So definitely check those out first, and then get onto the friggin' fucking heavy stuff. And the final album on this list, Shouting at the Ground by Zoviet France, is a real favourite of mine. One of my top 10, in fact, of the ambient genre. It was, I guess you could call it tribal ambient. I think that's the genre tag that goes along with it. Tribal ambient, in the sense that the band were interested in using acoustic instruments from around the world and incorporating them into their ambient sound. One thing about this record is it's slightly dated sounding. Came out in 1988, Shouting at the Ground did. And it kind of suffers a little bit from, like I say, dated sounds that may not affect other records from that time period, like Jon Hassell or Steve Roach or Brian Eno, in fact, himself. And it kind of makes me feel like Shouting at the Ground is more of a DIY album than it is a tribal ambient masterpiece. It's a DIY album that has more, I think, in common with post-punk, like bands such as This Heat, even. I see more of a comparison with Zoviet France and This Heat than I do Zoviet France and, say, Steve Roach, another tribal ambient musician. But that's not really telling much about the actual music itself. And if you've not heard Zoviet France before, believe me, the sounds they create are cavernous, they're expansive, they go off miles in every direction. It's just really music to kind of escape with, I guess, if you want that. It's music to take you somewhere, take you away from yourself or your location currently. And this album is a stellar example of that, especially the final 2 songs. In fact, the final 2 songs are so long that they take up the whole second disc of this record, so definitely check out Shamony Influence and The Death of Trees if you want to melt. But then I also enjoy the kind of experimentations with, I guess, world instruments on the A and the B sides. They're kind of cool. But for me, when it comes to Zoviet France, I want my tracks as long as possible. Definitely check this album out if you like the cover as well. It's a fantastic cover. It really encapsulates the sound, I think. But check it out if you like the cover. That's what I did, and I'm still here, so, Zoviet France, one of my 10 favourite albums of the ambient genre. Shouting at the Ground. So that about concludes the list, actually. Obviously there's plenty more I could have included, which I might even make into a second video someday. There's also plenty more albums by bands that I included, like I said before, Brian Eno. There's so many great ambient albums that he made, which I've even made a list of the top 10 in the comments that you can check out. But let me know what your favourite ambient albums are in the comments. I'd be really interested in seeing what it is that you're into, what you're listening to at the minute, what I missed, or if you just want to show some love for some of the ones that I've also said here, then feel free to do that. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Bye bye.